Hi everyone, welcome back to our channel. Today we're going to talk about something really important, the history of Indigenous people in Canada and their relationship with the police. This is a topic that has deep roots and significant implications for understanding the present and shaping the future. The history of Indigenous people in Canada and their relationship with the police is a complex and often painful story. It is a story of resilience, resistance, and the ongoing struggle for justice and recognition. Indigenous activist. For many years, Indigenous people in Canada have experienced unfair treatment from the police. This unfair treatment has been a part of a larger system of colonialism that has sought to control and assimilate Indigenous peoples. This system has been used to take away their land, resources, and rights. The police have often been the enforcers of these unjust policies, leading to a deep mistrust between Indigenous communities and law enforcement. Since Europeans first arrived, policing has been a way to try and force Indigenous people to give up their culture. The early interactions between European settlers and Indigenous peoples were marked by attempts to impose European laws and ways of life on Indigenous communities. We're going to explore how this has affected Indigenous communities. The impact of colonial policing on Indigenous cultures, languages, and ways of life has been profound and long-lasting. We'll look at how policing started and how it's been used to make Indigenous resistance seem like a crime. From the early days of colonization to the present, Indigenous resistance has often been criminalized and met with force. By understanding the past, we can better understand the challenges Indigenous people still face today. The legacy of colonial policing continues to affect Indigenous communities in many ways, from over-policing to under-protection. Indigenous activist. But this is also a story of strength. Despite the many challenges they have faced, Indigenous communities have shown incredible resilience and strength. Even with these huge challenges, Indigenous communities keep resisting. From Idle No More to protecting Wet'suwet'en land, Indigenous people are standing up for their rights and their land. Indigenous people are fighting back. They are organizing, protesting, and advocating for their rights in many different ways. Their bravery inspires everyone who wants a fairer future. The courage and determination of Indigenous activists serve as a powerful example for all of us. This video is a call to action. We need to recognize the ongoing struggles of Indigenous communities and support their fight for justice. The fight for Indigenous rights isn't over. There is still much work to be done to address the injustices and inequalities that Indigenous people face. We need to support Indigenous communities in their search for justice. This means listening to their voices, amplifying their stories, and standing in solidarity with them. We need to change the systems that still hurt them and build a future where their rights are respected. Together, we can create a more just and equitable society for all. One big change was the creation of the Northwest Mounted Police in 1873. This force was established to bring order to the Western Territories of Canada, which were then largely uncharted and inhabited by Indigenous peoples. The government saw the need for a paramilitary force to assert control over these vast lands. Their job was to claim Western Canada for the government, which involved not only maintaining law and order, but also facilitating the expansion of Canadian sovereignty. This expansion was often at the expense of Indigenous communities who had lived on these lands for generations. This meant pushing Indigenous people off their land so others could settle there. The Northwest Mounted Police played a crucial role in this process, enforcing policies that led to the displacement and marginalization of Indigenous populations. Historical expert, the Northwest Mounted Police, later called the Royal Canadian Mounted Police or RCMP, became known for enforcing these unfair laws. They were instrumental in implementing policies that were designed to assimilate Indigenous peoples into European Canadian culture, often through coercive and violent means. Laws like the Indian Act tried to force Indigenous people to give up their traditions and beliefs. This act was a cornerstone of the Canadian government's policy of assimilation, aiming to eradicate Indigenous cultures and languages. The RCMP's actions caused a lot of pain and loss for Indigenous communities. Families were torn apart, and cultural practices were suppressed. The legacy of these actions is still felt today, as many Indigenous communities continue to struggle with the impacts of these historical injustices. They represented the government's power and control. The RCMP were not just enforcers of the law, they were symbols of the colonial government's authority and its efforts to reshape the social and cultural landscape of Canada. Their actions led to the unfair treatment that Indigenous communities still face today. The history of the Northwest Mounted Police and the RCMP is a reminder of the deep-rooted issues of colonialism and the ongoing struggle for justice and reconciliation in Canada. One way the police did this was by enforcing unfair laws. The Indian Act, for example, limited where Indigenous people could go, banned ceremonies, and forced them to live on reserves. Indigenous elder. Because Indigenous communities are watched so closely by police, many are arrested and put in jail. Indigenous people are much more likely to be stopped, searched, and arrested than non-Indigenous people. This is because of unfair treatment within the police and justice systems. This isn't just history, it's still happening. From arresting people protecting their land to the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, Indigenous people still face violence and oppression. Recently, two significant movements have brought Indigenous rights to the forefront of public consciousness: Idle No More and the Wet'suwet'en Land Defense. These movements have not only highlighted the ongoing struggles of Indigenous communities, but have also galvanized support from allies around the world. The Solidarity Movement leader Idle No More began in 2012, sparked by the efforts of 4 women who were deeply concerned about the Canadian government's legislative changes that threatened Indigenous sovereignty and environmental protections. This grassroots movement quickly gained momentum, bringing together Indigenous people from across Canada and beyond, united in their fight for justice and recognition. The movement's supporters were particularly worried about the potential damage to the environment and the erosion of Indigenous rights. They saw the government's actions as a direct threat to their lands, waters, and way of life, prompting widespread protests and calls for action. Idle No More led to numerous protests, educational events, and community gatherings. These activities aim to raise awareness about the issues facing Indigenous communities and to educate the broader public about the importance of protecting Indigenous rights and the environment. Indigenous youth. Meanwhile, the Wet'suwet'en people have been engaged in a long-standing battle to prevent pipelines from being constructed on their traditional territories in British Columbia. This struggle has been marked by a deep commitment to protecting their land, water, and cultural heritage from the impacts of industrial development. The Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs have consistently opposed the pipelines, asserting their right to control their land and water. Their stance has been a powerful assertion of Indigenous sovereignty and a call for respect for their traditional governance systems. These movements, while distinct in their origins and methods, share a common goal to have Indigenous rights recognized and to dismantle the systems that continue to oppress Indigenous peoples. They employ a variety of tactics, from peaceful protests and legal challenges to direct action and international advocacy, all aimed at achieving justice and equality. Together, these movements demonstrate the resilience and strength of Indigenous communities. They are a testament to the enduring spirit of Indigenous peoples and their unwavering determination to build a better future for themselves and future generations. Through their efforts, they continue to inspire and mobilize others to join the fight for a more just and equitable world.